So, can you describe the difference between the competency model, the task model, and the evidence model now?
So the competency model is this is the set of let me think of a good way to put this. So, okay, so let's say I take from social studies education, historical thinking.
Sure.
Okay, now there's some group of people that think historical thinking involves a pretty standard set of heuristics, of literacy heuristics, right? And they involve that when historians read texts, read primary sources, right, as a way to start to begin to construct narratives about the past. Well, they do something called sourcing a text, right? So they ask themselves, well, who produced this text, right? And that there's the possibility of, okay, well, is there some agenda in the production of a text? They contextualize a text, right? So they read about what's going on, or they see what's going on in this text, and then they try to place that in some broader social setting, or whatever the historical setting is. And then they try to corroborate it, right? So they try to connect it to other sources potentially. So let's say that those three things are the competencies associated with historical thinking. So the competency model is just that, right? Is me sort of saying, okay, well, historical thinking is a thing. It's not in the world. I can't touch it. I can't taste it. But there are behaviors associated with it that I can see, right? And so the competency model breaks down those behaviors, right? Such that then we have a way of measuring them, right? Now, to get to the task and the evidence model, these are really about, again, sort of the construction of an environment, a problem space. Could be on paper, could be a game, right? But there has to be some stimulus or some stimuli that we as test creators believe are going to call for the use of those competencies, right? And then the evidence model says, okay, well, what do we need to see? Right? What do we need to look for in this problem space? So we know what those competencies are, and we've defined them, and we say, you know, well, we know what it looks like this when we see it, right? So the competency model is sort of the high, almost abstraction, right? But then we get into the, okay, if this is something that happens in the real world, what do we need to see? And if the test is embedded in a game, what do we need to see in the game?
Right.
And what do we need to create in the game that's going to require players to use those competencies to overcome problems? Does that make sense?
It does. And it's important to have those clearly defined at the outset, right? So we know, because what we don't want to do is miss those competencies, right? We don't want to miss those opportunities for assessment.
That's right.
So it's important to deeply interrogate those questions ahead of time, understanding your audience, your learning objectives, and, you know, where are you trying, what do you want the students to really deeply understand that they can then apply to the real world through the simulated experience?
Exactly right. And, you know, I think evidence-centered design exists in a close relationship with backward design, right? Again, sort of starting from where do you want your learners to get, and how do you know it? How are you going to know it when you see it? Right? And then everything is based off of that in terms of the design of the problem space.
Yeah. So what's interesting is, so, you know, in this course, what the students are going to be doing, they're going to be going to a museum, they're going to be looking at exhibits, and they're going to already see some products of that. I think you know, I was trying to think of I guess from ethnographic point, there's be secondhand sources, maybe in third-hand sources in some cases. But those ethnographies have already been distilled into a presentation that the students are going to then be building their games off of. And so in that moment, that's really important really look carefully at the subject headings and what are the call out elements that the museum exhibitors designed, because those might be really emblematic of the competencies they want students to, or they want their visitors to walk away with.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And it can be really challenging, right? Because it's not, so we have sort of knowledge, skills, and dispositions, right? And if we're interested, or perhaps we're even interested in evoking a feeling,
Mm.
and then we have to think about as evaluators, okay, well, how are we going to know it when we see that feeling, right? How are we going to know it when we
Right.
see that attitude?
Right.
And typically, if you're a test maker, you're creating some situation, some problem, you're putting something in front of a learner so that they have an opportunity to show you that evidence, right?
And again, we've talked about this with Dave a little bit, and that is what we're trying to do is get to the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy of demonstrating competency by using higher magnitude of thinking and different dispositions. So if your creation of something, say some kind of artifact that you're building, that's you imbuing a creative experience with the knowledge that you've learned, and that's a way to demonstrate. It might be harder to evaluate, but but the learner might intrinsically more successfully understand what the learning outcomes were initially.
Possibly, that's right.
Yep. Possibly, yeah, right. Oh, possibly, right. Okay. So we're going to talk real quick, and I know you and I have talked about this a little bit about Bayesian networks, and we're not going to do a big dive on Bayesian networks, but I think it's important to at least understand the basics here, just simply so we can get the second part of where the authors were coming from. So help us understand in layman's terms, what do we need to know about Bayesian networks?
I think the most important thing to know about Bayesian networks is that it is a statistical, it's a method within statistics of making predictions about future behaviors, right? Based on some fairly random, or what can be perceived of as random events, right? And so the idea of using Bayesian networks in serious games, or games that have been developed using evidence-centered design models, being that, again, if we're confident about the construction, right? Feel like the game is valid in a very specific sense, right? That statisticians or psychometricians will tend to talk about, right? Like, does this thing that you say measures something, does it really do that, right? And if we feel confident about that, if the psychometricians feel confident about it, or whoever's doing the assessment feels confident about it, then there's reason to believe that the behaviors, the many behaviors in this space can be looked at and analyzed with respect to a learning progression, right? So trying to make some predictions about, okay, given these behaviors now, where do we think a learner is headed? And so I think, the most important thing, I would say, for most students who are looking at these materials, right, is not so much that you need to have a deep understanding of Bayesian networks. I think the most important thing, again, is to really sort of to focus on this idea of validity, is to focus on this idea of, is the game, do the mechanics in the game, do the problems in the game give players opportunities to exhibit the competencies that we're hoping to see, right? And if the answer is yes, then we have some more confidence about using that play data to make inferences about learning.
And this is done in play testing too, right? That's part of the process, is of actually to put it in the world. It's one thing to have it on a whiteboard, it's another thing to actually build the thing and then see how the mechanics actually play out in a real world setting.
That's exactly right. And that's true for the development of any test, right? That's true of any intervention period. Ideally, it's tested repeatedly with different audiences that are representative of the ultimate audience for whom it's being developed.
Yeah. And the only other thing I want to make sure that to get in there is that there was a point they made and I thought was fascinating, that this is how a lot of neural networks are developed.
Exactly.
And that, so, we've talked before, Dave has mentioned in his session a little bit about how AI might play a larger and larger role in game design and game development. It's through these kinds of networks, these kinds of neural networks, is that's what would give rise to the game design process, perhaps even almost in real time down the road. Yeah, potentially.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. And so, can you give us a good example of game designers successfully building assessments into their games that balance the student's exploration and structured data collection? Like, what's a really just amazing example that you might have seen in your research and your work?
So, if your students haven't looked at them, there's a company called Filament Games that has done some interesting work in terms of creating games that are really putting players in situations where they have to practice these targeted competencies, and then they are serving up data that is going to be useful for educators, right? So that's the other part of it. It's you can collect the data, but it has to be useful. It has to be usable to someone. Now, if you're just thinking about a game, if the game is a self-enclosed unit, right, then all of this data is being collected. And maybe it's being interpreted, right? So maybe things in the game are changing based on the collection of that data. But most educational games are not there, right? And really what we want is human beings looking at that data and being in a position to make inferences about that data. So if you look at Filament Games, for example, but there are other companies that are doing this, they have dashboards, right, that are then putting this play data in front of educators, ideally with some explanation of why. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah. Hold on. Sorry, that's my
It's
husband.
okay. No problem.
You want me to start again?
Just give me the beginning of that sentence, like where I want, if you're talking about play data and the.
Well, so the play data, it needs to be presented such that it's usable, right? It needs to be presented such that educators, whether they're K-12 classroom teachers or whether they're in higher ed or wherever they are, they need to be able to make sense of the data so that they have some understanding of whether their students are moving along on a learning progression, right?
Yeah.
So again, there's the game Civilization was also a really interesting. There's been a bunch of work done over the years, in using Civilization to support systems thinking skills.
Yep.
And there was interesting work done. This is going back at least 10 years, using evidence-centered design models, right? So that's a complex space, right? There's a lot of variables at play in a game like Civilization. And so based on the modeling, putting kids into scenarios in the game in which they have opportunities to make decisions about all of these variables, right? And then putting that data out in such a way for the player as well in the game, right? So that if you can actually see in the heads up display, you can see some of that data so that you can make decisions about where you are as a learner in the ideal case, right? But again, getting that data out to educators and saying, okay, here's the competencies, and here's how the data relates to the competencies, and here's what the data for this student or for this set of students might be telling you about where they are with respect to developing those competencies.
Yeah. And I've seen educators really care about this in areas of knowledge gaps. So as they're saying, Johnny should be knowing this, they played the game, they've proven that through the evidence, right, through the play data, they did not meet this particular goal. And now we have a gap here that needs to be identified, that needs to be addressed in another way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Jim. I really appreciate it. This has really been valuable. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom for us and giving some real insights. And this has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good afternoon.